The Miami heat radiated off the pavement, but nothing was colder than the numbness in Jennifer's chest. Clutching a single cardboard box, her few remaining possessions, and a hidden data drive, she kept her head down and fled the estate gates. Minutes ago, she'd been humiliated, stripped of her dignity, and thrown out into the street. Her crime? Saving a child's life by neutralizing a synthetic neurotoxin disguised as an allergic reaction. Then the ground trembled. 6 matte black, armor-plated Escalades roared around the corner, boxing her in against the concrete wall. The doors swung open in unison. A dozen operatives in tactical suits stepped out, forming a perimeter around her. Nobody spoke, nobody moved, until one of them did. A man walked forward, unhurried, like the street already belonged to him. Black shirt unbuttoned, a thin scar tracing his jaw, the only thing on him that looked less than perfectly controlled. He stopped inches from her face, close enough that she could see her own reflection in his eyes. Eyes that weren't looking for a stranger, they were looking for her. "Where," he said quietly, "is the nanny?" Not a question, a demand dressed as one. The sprawling, sun-drenched Flores estate in Miami was a masterclass in superficial perfection, but to Jennifer, it was a tactical hiding spot. Scrubbing down the marble counters of the grand kitchen, she kept her posture small and her breathing steady. After years of running from a dangerous family legacy, she desperately wanted to bury. Masquerading as a simple, invisible domestic worker was her shield. Her primary mission was absolute obscurity, a quiet life that kept her and her chronically ill younger brother entirely off the grid. "Still grazing, I see." A cold, sharp voice cut through the silence. Jennifer didn't flinch. She turned to face Beatrice, the family's icy matriarch, whose eyes swept over Jennifer's heavy, cardigan-clad frame with familiar disgust. "A woman of your proportions should really focus more on labor and less on lingering, Jennifer. If you spent half as much time tracking Leo as you do carrying extra weight, my grandson might actually look presentable for the evening gala." Jennifer lowered her gaze, letting the insult wash over her like water. Her hyper-vigilant mind internalized the cruelty as merely a cost of survival. She couldn't afford to push back. Her brother's specialized medical care depended entirely on this under-the-table salary. Beatrice assumed she was dealing with a broken, desperate girl, entirely unaware that Jennifer was a trained professional, watching every exit, logging every security detail, and calculating the house blind spots out of sheer habit. The only warmth in the entire cold mansion belonged to 4-year-old Leo. Later that afternoon, as the boy curled against her side while she read him a story, Jennifer felt a rare pang of vulnerability. She loved the boy fiercely, a dangerous liability in her line of work. She had built thick emotional walls to ensure she carried the weight of the world completely alone, convinced that trusting anyone else would lead to ruin. But as she smoothed Leo's hair, her sharp eyes noticed a subtle, erratic twitch in the boy's eyelids, and the faint, sweet scent of almonds lingering near his freshly delivered pre-gala juice glass. It wasn't an allergic reaction brewing. Her blood ran cold as her tactical training kicked in. A highly sophisticated, slow-acting neurotoxin was already flooding the child's system. The proxy war had arrived at the front gates, and her invisible sanctuary was about to explode. The grand ballroom downstairs pulsed with the muffled bass of classical strings and the high society chatter of Miami's elite, completely detached from the silent horror unfolding in the nursery. Leo's chest heaved erratically, his tiny fingernails turning a terrifying shade of cyanotic blue as the neurotoxin mimicked a violent, catastrophic anaphylactic shock. Jennifer's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. She scooped the suffocating boy into her arms and sprinted down the back staircase, bursting into the private study where Beatrice was hosting a select group of high-profile investors. "He isn't breathing," Jennifer gasped, her voice cutting through the elegant murmurs. The boy has been poisoned. We need an emergency transport right now." Beatrice's eyes flashed with venomous rage, not at her grandson's condition, but at the disruption. She stepped between Jennifer and the guests, her voice a lethal, hushed hiss. "Lower your voice, you foolish girl. It's a mild allergy. I will not have you staging a scene and ruining tonight's press coverage. Put him in the back room. We will handle it quietly after the gala." "He will be dead in 2 minutes," Jennifer shot back, her protective instincts instantly shattering her invisible facade.
"I said wait!"
Beatrice snapped, signaling 2 private security guards who stepped forward, their hands resting menacingly near their jackets.
"You do not call anyone."
"You do not leave this house." Realizing Beatrice was actively protecting the optics of a hit, Jennifer didn't waste another second arguing. She spun on her heel, slamming her shoulder into the nearest guard to throw him off balance, and dashed toward the estate's private medical wing. The specialized counteragent she needed was locked inside Beatrice's biometric cabinet. With no time to bypass the system, Jennifer grabbed a heavy, solid bronze sculpture from a nearby pedestal. Channeling every ounce of her strength, she smashed it violently against the reinforced glass panel. The glass shattered in a spectacular explosion of shards. Ignoring the deep cuts opening on her hands, she plunged her arm into the wreckage, ripped open the medical drawer, and grabbed a preloaded syringe of epinephrine and a clinical respiratory stimulant. She drove the needle deep into Leo's thigh. A long, agonizing second passed before the boy violently gasped, air finally rushing back into his collapsing lungs. Sweeping his shivering body into her arms, Jennifer broke through the emergency exit, hot-wired a parked staff vehicle, and tore through the estate gates, leaving the screaming security detail in her dust as she raced toward the hospital. The sterile smell of the hospital still clung to Jennifer's clothes when she stepped back through the imposing iron gates of the mansion. Leo was safe, monitored by a team of bewildered physicians who couldn't explain how a simple nanny had executed such flawless, high-stakes triage. But the relief in Jennifer's chest vanished the moment she entered the grand foyer. Beatrice stood at the top of the double staircase, flanked by 3 private security guards and a grim-faced corporate lawyer. The high society guests were gone, replaced by a suffocating, hostile silence. "There she is," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with calculated malice as she descended the stairs. "The thief who almost murdered my grandson." Jennifer stopped dead in her tracks, her hyper-vigilant mind immediately tracing the exits as she felt the trap close around her. "I saved his life, Beatrice. The boy was intentionally poisoned with a slow-acting neurotoxin. If I hadn't broken into that cabinet—" "Silence," Beatrice hissed, stepping into Jennifer's personal space. "You broke into my private vault, stole invaluable family heirlooms, and then violently assaulted my security detail to abduct a vulnerable child. You poisoned him yourself, Jennifer, administering a dangerous cocktail of drugs just to play the hero and cover your tracks. The police have already been notified of your gross negligence and theft." The sheer, staggering audacity of the lie hit Jennifer like a physical blow. Beatrice wasn't just throwing a tantrum. She was actively executing a cover-up for the rival cartel, shifting the blame of a botched hit onto an overweight, disposable domestic worker. "You know exactly what happened tonight," Jennifer said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. "What I know is that you are a liability," Beatrice sneered, her eyes raking over Jennifer's stained cardigan with absolute disgust. "You don't belong in a house of this caliber. You are disgusting, insubordinate, and finished. You have exactly 5 minutes to clear your room before my guards drag you out in handcuffs." The public humiliation was systematic and cruel. Under the cold, mocking stares of the house staff, Jennifer was forced to pack her life into a single, small cardboard box. She placed her mother's framed photo on top, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that her invisible shield had been shattered. Escorted to the edge of the property line, the heavy iron gates slammed shut behind her, leaving her isolated, blacklisted, and entirely exposed to the storm brewing in the Miami underworld. The heat of the Miami sun beat down on the endless stretch of asphalt, baking the air until it felt like a physical weight pressing against Jennifer's chest. The exclusive, gated community stretched for miles, a paradise of manicured lawns and towering palms that now felt like an open-air prison. With her beat-up sedan having been repossessed the week before due to missed payments, she had no choice but to walk. Her sensible flats offered little protection against the radiating heat of the pavement, and with every step, the cardboard box in her arms grew heavier. She stopped under the meager shade of a traveler's palm, her breathing ragged as she stared down into the box. Sitting right on top was the faded silver frame holding her mother's photograph. Looking at her mother's gentle smile, the heavy dam of Jennifer's hyper-vigilant defense mechanism finally cracked. Quiet, hot tears spilled over her cheeks, mixing with the sweat on her face. The arithmetic of her reality was terrifying. Rent on the cramped apartment she shared with her chronically ill younger brother was due in 48 hours, and her savings were entirely depleted from his last round of specialized medication. She had no professional references, no remaining income, and a completely fabricated black mark on her record that branded her a thief and a child endangerer. In the tight-knit world of high-end domestic service, Beatrice's lies would spread like wildfire. Jennifer was blacklisted, broke, and entirely compromised. Wiping her face with a trembling sleeve, she forced herself to stand upright and keep moving. Just make it to the main highway, she told herself, tightening her grip on the soggy edges of the cardboard box, one foot in front of the other. But as she stepped back onto the shimmering blacktop of the deserted estate road, her acute survival instincts flared. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. The air didn't just feel heavy anymore, it felt charged, like the quiet before a devastating flash of lightning. She wasn't alone on this road, and the sanctuary she had spent years trying to build was officially gone. The Miami heat radiated off the pavement, but nothing was colder than the numbness in Jennifer's chest. Clutching a single cardboard box, her few remaining possessions, and a hidden data drive, she kept her head down and fled the estate gates. Minutes ago, she'd been humiliated, stripped of her dignity, and thrown out into the street. Her crime? Saving a child's life by neutralizing a synthetic neurotoxin disguised as an allergic reaction. Then the ground trembled. 6 matte black, armor-plated Escalades roared around the corner, boxing her in against the concrete wall. The doors swung open in unison. A dozen operatives in tactical suits stepped out, forming a perimeter around her. Nobody spoke, nobody moved, until one of them did. A man walked forward, unhurried, like the street already belonged to him. Black shirt unbuttoned, a thin scar tracing his jaw, the only thing on him that looked less than perfectly controlled. He stopped inches from her face, close enough that she could see her own reflection in his eyes that weren't looking for a stranger. They were looking for her. "Where," he said quietly, "is the nanny?" Not a question. A demand dressed as one. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of the Flores syndicate's full tactical presence bore down on her, but Jennifer refused to break. Her hyper-vigilant mind cataloged the weapons, the spacing of the guards, and the lethal authority radiating from the tattooed man standing over her. She had spent years running from a dangerous underworld legacy, but looking into the eyes of Luis Flores, she realized the time for hiding was over. She forced her chin up, meeting his terrifying gaze with absolute, unyielding defiance. "I am the nanny," Jennifer said, her voice dropping into a low, steady pitch that cut cleanly through the low hum of the idling engines. "And if you're here to finish the hit your ex-in-laws botched at the gala, you're looking at the wrong target. Leo is stable. I neutralized the poison." The lethal, aggressive tension in Luis's posture vanished in an instant. A look of absolute shock washed over his sharp features, rapidly melting into a profound, almost breathless reverence. He didn't look at her heavy, dust-stained clothes with the disgust she had faced at the mansion. He looked at her like she was the most magnificent force he had ever encountered. The kingpin had found his son's savior, and the game had just changed. The silence that followed her declaration was heavier than the humid Miami air. Luis stepped closer, the dangerous aura radiating from him shifting from an interrogation into a dark, simmering protectiveness. "Leo is my son," he murmured, his voice a low, lethal hum that vibrated through the quiet street. "My treacherous ex-in-laws stole him, hiding him away within these gates, to use as a pawn in their proxy war. I've been hunting for him for months." His gaze dropped to the soggy cardboard box clutched tightly against Jennifer's chest, noting the cheap silver frame of her mother's photograph sticking out from the top. "And they threw you out like trash for keeping him alive?" Jennifer nodded slowly, her hyper-vigilant defenses momentarily faltering under the sheer intensity of his stare. "Beatrice accused me of theft. She blacklisted me, took my livelihood, and left me with nothing because I exposed the hit." A terrifying, localized violence suddenly rippled through Luis's massive frame. He didn't yell, but the absolute rage tightening his jawline made the armed operatives around them visibly stiffen. Without a word, he reached out, his large, calloused hands remarkably gentle, as he took the heavy cardboard box from her aching arms and handed it to a nearby guard. Before she could protest, he unbuttoned his custom jacket and draped the heavy, warm fabric over her shivering shoulders. The jacket swallowed her frame, radiating his body heat and the faint, rich scent of dark tobacco and expensive leather. "You carried the weight of my son's life when my own security detail failed," Luis said, his dark eyes locking onto hers with absolute, unwavering devotion. "Which means you will never carry the weight of the world alone again. Beatrice Flores thinks she can destroy a woman of your brilliance to protect her cartel assets. She has no idea whose queen she just targeted." Luis turned sharply to his right-hand operative, his features turning to pure stone. "Marco?" "Yes, boss," the man replied, stepping forward instantly. "Initiate the terminal protocol against Flores Holdings," Luis ordered casually, as if requesting a routine drink. "Execute a hostile scorched earth financial buyout of Beatrice's entire real estate empire. Drain their liquidity, short their stocks, freeze their shell companies, and leave them completely bankrupt by morning. I want her cornered." He turned back to Jennifer, a dark, devastating smile touching his lips as he opened the door to the lead escalade. "Get in, Jennifer. We are taking you and your brother home, and then we are going to burn their empire to the ground." The transition from the exposed, sweltering streets of Miami to the towering concrete walls of Luis's private compound felt like crossing into an entirely different reality. Nestled deep within a heavily guarded estate, the fortress was an impenetrable sanctuary, bristling with high-end security and elite tactical operatives who moved with silent precision. Yet, inside the main villa, the cold atmosphere of a criminal empire completely dissolved. Within hours of their arrival, Luis's personal medical team had already mobilized. A private wing of the estate was transformed into a state-of-the-art clinical suite, where top-tier specialists took over the management of Jennifer's younger brother's chronic illness. For the first time in years, the crushing financial weight and constant panic of securing specialized medication vanished from Jennifer's shoulders. But the true shock lay in how Luis treated Jennifer herself. Surrounded by immense luxury, she expected to be treated as an employee or a passing liability. Instead, Luis handled her with a profound, unyielding respect that chipped away at her hyper-vigilant defenses. That evening, as she stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the guest suite, wrapped in a plush silk robe, Luis stepped into the room. He didn't maintain the distance of a traditional employer. He walked right up to her, his dark eyes sweeping over her face, completely captivated. "My team tells me your brother is stabilizing," he said softly, his voice losing its lethal edge. "I don't know how to thank you," Jennifer murmured, looking down at her hands, her deep-seated insecurities flaring. "I'm used to doing everything alone. I'm just a domestic worker who got caught in the crossfire." Luis reached out, his large, tattooed hand gently cupping her jaw, forcing her to look up and meet his gaze. "Stop hiding behind that lie," he commanded softly, his thumb tracing the soft curve of her face. "Society looks at you and expects you to be invisible, but I look at you and see a woman who single-handedly dismantled a professional cartel hit. I see immense beauty in your softness, your protective instinct, and a fierce bravery that outshines every soldier I own. You are safe here, Jennifer, and you are exactly where you belong." For the first time in her life, Jennifer felt the heavy emotional walls around her heart begin to crumble, realizing that in the arms of Miami's most dangerous man, she was finally protected. 3 days later, the high-stakes boardroom of Flores Holdings was a suffocating chamber of absolute panic. The sudden, catastrophic financial collapse, orchestrated by the Flores syndicate, had blindsided the entire executive board. Beatrice sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she aggressively reviewed the bleeding stock tickers and frozen offshore assets. The firm was completely hemorrhaging liquidity, facing a total structural ruin before the opening bell, and no one knew who was pulling the strings. "We just need to stall the regulators," Beatrice hissed, her voice tight with desperate fury. "We liquidate our secondary real estate assets, cover the margin calls, and bury the investigation into the gala incident before." The heavy oak double doors of the boardroom violently swung open, the echo cutting through the room like a guillotine. Silence fell instantly. A dozen elite, armed operatives in tailored black tactical suits stepped inside, fluidly fanning out to secure the corners of the room. The executives froze, realizing the physical proxy war had finally breached their inner sanctum. Then, she walked in. Jennifer crossed the threshold completely transformed, and the collective gasp from the board was deafening. She wasn't wearing the shapeless, stained cardigans of an invisible domestic worker. She wore a jaw-dropping, custom-tailored crimson designer wrap dress that perfectly and unapologetically accentuated her heavy curves, cinching elegantly at her waist and flowing with high-end, lethal sophistication. Her dark hair cascaded in flawless, glossy waves, and her expression held no trace of her former, hyper-vigilant isolation. She looked breathtaking, powerful, and utterly dangerous. Walking right beside her, their arms intimately linked, was Luis Flores. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit that screamed unadulterated wealth and raw, lethal authority, his dark eyes fixed on Beatrice with a terrifying, calm satisfaction. Jennifer didn't wait for permission. Striding to the head of the table, she pulled out the central leather executive chair. She didn't look at the stunned faces of her former abusers with fear. She looked at them like a grand master looking at a beaten chessboard. Luis stood right behind her like an immovable dark guardian, resting his large, tattooed hands on the back of her seat. Jennifer folded her hands smoothly on the polished wood, a lethal smile touching her lips. "Good morning, Beatrice," she said, her voice steady and chillingly calm. "I believe it's time to talk about who really owns this empire." Beatrice gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her face draining of all color as she stared at the woman she had so easily discarded. You are nothing but an insubordinate servant," she spat, her voice cracking under the pressure. "You cannot simply walk into my boardroom and—" "It isn't your boardroom anymore, Beatrice," Luis interrupted, his voice a low, lethal purr that reverberated through the silent room. He leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto the trembling matriarch. As of 48 hours ago, Vanguard Holdings purchased 82% of your company's voting shares. I own this building, I own your assets, and I own your debt. The executive sat frozen, entirely paralyzed by the absolute execution of power. Luis signaled smoothly, and Marco stepped forward, slamming a thick manila folder onto the polished wood right in front of Beatrice. My operations team did a little digging into your flawless corporate image, Jennifer said, her voice dripping with dangerous, calm authority. She leaned back in the executive chair, her crimson dress catching the light. That folder contains unredacted bank records tracing millions diverted from your family's charitable funds into private offshore accounts. More importantly, it contains the chemical analysis of the neurotoxin introduced to Leo's system under your roof. Beatrice collapsed into her chair, realizing she was entirely destroyed. Right on cue, the heavy double doors opened once more. 2 federal agents walked into the boardroom, their expressions stoic as they approached the head of the table. Luis Flores, the lead agent announced, pulling out a pair of steel handcuffs. You are under arrest for corporate embezzlement, financial fraud, and felony child endangerment. Jennifer watched silently, a profound, overwhelming sense of satisfaction washing over her as the woman who had humiliated her was read her rights and dragged out of the room in disgrace. The old prison of her hyper-vigilant isolation completely shattered. When the room cleared, leaving only the tactical perimeter, Luis walked around the side of the table and knelt right beside her chair, completely uncaring of his expensive suit. He took her hands in his large, tattooed fingers warm against hers. The Flores estate and our foundations need a new director, Luis murmured softly, looking up into her eyes with a fierce, burning devotion. Someone with the brilliance to run the strategy and the courage to protect our people. I want you, Jennifer, not as a hidden servant, but as the true matriarch of this city. Shedding the last remnants of her lifelong insecurities, Jennifer looked down at the man who ruled Miami, realizing she was no longer running from her past. She was his sole obsession, his operational partner, and the absolute queen of his empire. A dangerous, beautiful smile touched her lips as she leaned down, letting the old world burn behind them.